Well, it's so good to have you with us for this spring Bible study. We will be doing this for the Wednesdays in May, and we are focusing on great women of the Bible. We could certainly have taken half a year or a whole year and talked about great women in the Bible, great women of the church, and yet we're just going to do 4 of those women. And we're beginning today with Ruth, with the book of Ruth. So that's the book in the Old Testament that we will be focusing on. So if you want to go ahead and find Ruth, it's right after the book of Judges in the beginning of the Old Testament. So that gives you an idea of where it is. We'll open with a prayer and then we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we thank you in this month of Mother's Day. We thank you for all the women who are important to us and who have been pillars of faith and strength for us. We ask that you would be with us during this Bible study and that it might be meaningful and helpful to all who hear it. In the name of Christ our Savior, amen. Well, the title of this particular chapter is Ruth the Foreigner. This wonderful story takes place during the time after the Exodus when the Hebrews, remember that's God's family, when the Hebrews are settling in to the promised land. Now remember the Hebrews were sons and daughters of Abraham. They were led out of Egypt in slavery by Moses and into the promised land. And then we know there is a period of I guess the word is conquering, where they are taking control, taking possession of the land that God promised to give to Abraham and his descendants. And so the book of Judges speaks about this time as a time of real conflict and warfare. The Hebrews are constantly conquering and expelling other peoples out of the promised land. And if you remember from your Sunday school lessons, you will remember that there was a very strict avoidance of any sort of mingling or cohabitation or certainly intermarrying between Hebrews and the foreigners who were already in the land of Canaan. The Hebrews, as I said, were considered God's family. They are God's chosen ones. And everyone else is considered unpure and prone to defile the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so there is no intermingling or intermarriage that goes on among these groups. The primary reason, of course, is that it would bring other gods and other religions into the Hebrew faith. And of course, we know that the Jews were very distinctive in believing that there was only one God and that this was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so they were very reluctant, they were very cautious, they were very afraid of having intermarriage between people of different faiths, very concerned about what that might do to dilute the Jewish faith. Now, in contrast to this idea of a period of great conflict and conflict only, the book of Ruth talks about this as a relatively peaceful time. The book of Ruth deals with very normal, everyday experiences in the life of hardworking people and hardworking farmers in particular. So there's not a lot of conflict in the book of Ruth. There is a lot of sex in the book of Ruth, and we won't just be focusing on that so much. We're trying to keep this to be a G-rated Bible study, but you should know that if you want something a little more scintillating in the Old Testament, that the book of Ruth is probably one of those places that you can go. couple of things to know about the book of Ruth and about this time. First of all, famine was a particularly common experience in Palestine. You know, Palestine is not like Egypt with the great Nile River. Palestine is not like Mesopotamia with the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers that we remember from geography class in junior high school. Palestine is dependent entirely upon rainfall for water. And so when there was a period of drought, crops suffered and people would leave. And so we know that as you look throughout the Old Testament, there were people who were constantly leaving Palestine, constantly leaving an area to go somewhere where there was water. So this is no different. In the book of Ruth, the family of Elimelech goes to the area of Moab, and that is where presumably the drought is not so bad, and they are able to grow their crops. I mentioned Moab. You should remember that Moab and Israel were not particularly friendly with each other. Those two nations, those two peoples, they were related through Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, but Moab was looked down on by the Hebrews. There was no such thing as a good Moabite. It was in many ways the way that Jews in Jesus' day would have looked upon Samaritans. Samaritans were, of course, people were very prejudiced against Samaritans, and Jews in Ruth's day were very prejudiced against Moabites. And then I think the third thing that we need to remember is that this is a male-dominated society. I mean, here I am. I would be absolutely lost if it wasn't for Liz Fisher, who's doing the recording of these Bible studies. But in Ruth's day, it was a very male-dominated society. Women were in a precarious situation, and in particular, widows were in a precarious situation. They were very dependent, women were, on their husbands or their sons. Widows, because of their unusual circumstance, were allowed to glean in the fields. Remember that crops were harvested by hand, and so they could be very careful. So gleaning in the fields probably didn't give widows much of an opportunity to gather much food. But widows were also the recipients of a great deal of charity in that time, but it was still very hard for widows. In fact, it was not unusual at all for young widows to have to take up a life of prostitution in order to survive. So it was a very desperate time for widows, and that's the situation that two of our women find themselves in, Ruth and Naomi, and we're going to hear about that. Last thing, this is going to sound very strange to our modern day ears, but there was in that day something known as Levirate marriage. And it was the understanding that if a woman lost her husband and she was still of childbearing age, that the nearest male relative was expected to have sex with her in hopes of bearing a son. The birth of a son was seen as a way for this woman's dead husband to continue on in life. There was not a very strong understanding of an afterlife at that point in Judaism, and so this is a way for a widow's husband, who is now deceased, to live on through the birth of a son. There's no way to make that sound acceptable today. There's no way to make that sound understandable, but it was the custom and the rule of the day, this Levirate marriage. And so it's important to remember that if an heir is born, that heir, when he gets to be old enough, would begin to take care of the family. Naomi, who is Ruth's mother-in-law, is very bitter because all of the men in her life have died and she has no one to take care of her. Ruth loves her mother-in-law, and that relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law really occupies the center stage of this particular book. And it shows that even though Ruth was under no compulsion legally to take care of her mother-in-law, that for Ruth, the relationship was more important than the law. And that's something we see with Jesus again and again and again. Jesus was a good, observant Jew, but he was not going to let the law get in the way of relationships or get in the way of God's love. So that's kind of where we are. We're going to read, first of all, chapter 1 of Ruth, and we're going to read verses 1 through verse 18. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, who is the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These 2 sons took Moabite wives. Remember what we've said, that probably would not have been encouraged, and it would have been very controversial, but Naomi's 2 sons marry Moabite women. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So here we understand the situation that Naomi finds herself in. No husband, no sons, 2 daughters-in-law, and they are Moabites. And so then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So the drought is coming to an end back in Palestine. So Naomi set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have had a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Naomi was in such a bad situation that she felt that God Himself had abandoned her. And then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So you see there's a very close relationship between the mother-in-law and these two daughters-in-law. Naomi says, look, your prospects with me are very bleak as my prospects are. So what you should do is you should go back to your mother, back to your father, and find husbands there among the Moabites. And Orpah says reluctantly that she will do that, and she goes back. But Ruth loves Naomi and clings to her. And so Naomi said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, and this is going to be a very familiar passage of this book of Ruth for you. The words are the words of a very popular wedding song, maybe not so popular today as it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And we have typically thought that this wedding song, which is entitled Whither Thou Goest, was directed by a young wife to her fiance, to her future husband, or to her new husband. But that's not the case at all. Whither Thou Goest is really based on the words of a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law saying, I'm not going to leave you. Your people are going to become my people, and we are going to stay in this relationship, in this family that we have created. And so Ruth said, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. Those are certainly beautiful words, and we can hear in those words the depth of affection and love that the daughter-in-law Ruth has for her mother-in-law Naomi. So when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. And so that's where we are with Naomi and Ruth heading back to Judah, heading back to Palestine with their future very uncertain and their prospects very limited. Fortunately, there is a good guy in this story. And the good guy's name, well, let's be honest about it, the really good person in this story is God, who is going to make sure that Ruth and Naomi are not abandoned, but are going to be okay. But the good guy in this story is a man named Boaz. And this is beginning with chapter 2 in Ruth, the story of Ruth and her first meeting with Boaz. Again, now we're in chapter 2. I'll be reading verses 1 through 16. Now, Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor. And so Naomi said to her, go, my daughter. So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Ruth was not only a kind and wonderful and loving daughter-in-law, she was also a pretty shrewd woman. And she realized that this might be the opportunity for her to meet somebody and marry somebody who was going to take care of her and take care of her mother-in-law. So let's see what happens. Just then Boaz, I'm in verse 4, just then Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, this is Ruth, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. So we see that another quality that Ruth has is that she is very hardworking. She was not just out there passing the time of day and looking for a husband. She was out there working, getting food for herself and for her mother-in-law. And then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you." Isn't that a shame that in that day, as in today, women dealt with harassment from men on occasion. So Boaz is doing everything that he can to make sure that Ruth is not harassed. "If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then Ruth fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to Boaz, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" Well, we don't know exactly what Boaz saw in Ruth. Obviously, he saw that she was very loyal, hardworking. We have no understanding or no knowledge of what Boaz's religious views were, but it seems not to have bothered him that she was a Moabite. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." A very clear understanding here that Ruth is now, because of the way she treated Naomi, her mother-in-law, that Ruth is now not only under the protection of Boaz, but more importantly, that she is under the protection of God. Then Ruth said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread. Dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So very clearly, Boaz is looking out for Ruth. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. So here we see this first contact between Boaz and Ruth. And Ruth, even though she is a foreigner, she is very clearly fair and loyal and purposeful. She is thankful, she is hardworking, and she is very generous. There are some problems and difficulties that you can read about in chapter 2 and chapter 3 of Ruth's book. The problems largely are stemming from the fact that Boaz is probably not the closest relative to Ruth. There probably are some other males that are closer and would have, it sounds bad to say this, but would have the right of marrying Ruth before Boaz does. But God is resourceful. God finds a way. Ruth and Boaz are smart people, and they find a way to work around this, and God is working in this situation. And so by the time we get to the last chapter, which is chapter 4, everything has been worked out in a satisfactory way, and Boaz can take Ruth as his wife. And so I'm going to summarize this in saying that Ruth and Boaz end up getting married. It presumably is a wonderful relationship, and they have many children. Now, here's the interesting part of the story, the hook of the story, if you will. I'm going to ask you to turn to chapter 4 of the book of Ruth, and we're going to read verses 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. And Obed became the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. And David, of course, is the greatest king that Israel would ever know during the Old Testament period. Now, what an amazing story. I mean, here during this period of time, you have Israel so concerned about remaining pure, about not being influenced by foreign people, certainly not intermarrying with foreign people, because there's the threat of a new religion coming in. There's this idea of everyone else being inferior to the Jews. And yet here, Ruth, a Moabite, we could almost say a hated Moabite, Ruth, a Moabite, marries Boaz, and it is from this line that King David comes. And of course, when we read Matthew's gospel, we know that Jesus himself is descended from King David. And so if you read that genealogy of Matthew, you find Ruth's name mentioned in there as one of the ancestors of Jesus. Just an amazing thing. It's almost as if God said, yes, I know that you're very concerned about purity, and I know that you're very concerned about not mixing with other people, but let me show you what I'm going to do. And when that relationship between Ruth and Boaz was so strong, mimicking in many ways the relationship between Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. God did a wonderful thing and a beautiful thing, not only taking care of these two women, but really blessing the entirety of the world through King David and later through Jesus. It really is a wonderful story. I think there are three themes that we want to reiterate as we conclude this Bible study. Theme number one, all people are God's people. We, in our humanity, our weak humanity, we want to limit who is blessed. We want to limit who is worthy of God's love, God's grace, and God's acceptance. This is done not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. Nationality, race, religion, physical impairment. You remember last week's lesson that Liz read for us in worship about the Ethiopian eunuch and how he was ostracized and was not allowed to worship with God's people, partly because he was an Ethiopian and partly because he was a eunuch. All of those separations, all of those instances of wanting to limit and discriminate and separate, well, God overcomes all of those. All you need to do is read books like Ruth, books like Jonah, also in the Old Testament. All you need to do is think about individuals who didn't fit the mold as being perfect little people. People like Rahab the harlot, who is also one of Jesus' ancestors. Mary Magdalene. We think of Matthew the tax collector. We think of the Good Samaritan. We think of Moses with his temper, and Abraham with his scheming, and King David with his sexual escapades and sexual sin. Well, none of these were perfect people, but God used them. And God looks beyond the divisions and the separations that we human beings set up. And God establishes relationships and friendships and love among all of God's children. So, that is one thing to remember. All people are God's people. Secondly, God's providence and care happen not just in extraordinary times, but they happen in common everyday times, like the times in which Ruth was living. You know, days when there's not some huge cataclysmic event taking place, but days that are just ordinary days. Even on a day like today, when maybe the most extraordinary thing that we do is run to the grocery store or the drugstore. Maybe we watch a good movie on TV. Maybe we see an exciting sporting event or take a walk outside and enjoy the beauty of spring. Even though there's not something amazing taking place, that doesn't mean that God's providence and God's care has changed one bit. God is with us in magical times. God is with us in ordinary times, every day. And that's important to remember. And then finally, I think, the theme of a restoration to fullness. Naomi was so bitter, and rightfully so. She had lost her husband, she had lost her two sons. Her prospects were very bleak indeed. And it seemed that everything that Naomi had been taken away from her, and there was a real sense of emptiness and loss. And yet in the midst of that emptiness and loss, Naomi found God's presence and felt God's strength. And God provided a way. For Naomi, the way was through Ruth, a Moabite, a hated Moabite. It's Ruth that is there to help Naomi, and also, of course, Boaz. It's important, I think, to remember that God never desires that we suffer. God doesn't want bad things to happen to us so that, we would learn a lesson about it. But when bad things happen, I do believe that God is there to redeem those bad times. And in spite of the hard times, to yet teach us a lesson and to yet bring good out of these very desperate and difficult situations. And that is exactly what happens in the book of Ruth. Naomi is able to see God's care in the darkness as well as in the light. And certainly we can look at people in our Christian faith who were able to do that, people who found God's presence in the very bleakest of times. We think of Job, for example. Peter, after he had denied knowing Jesus, Peter was restored to a leadership position in the church. My goodness, what about Paul, the great persecutor of the church? Paul becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. And then in our own church history, Martin Luther, who, despairing of ever finding God's love, it was in the midst of being lonely, in the midst of being discouraged, that the power of the gospel really spoke to Martin Luther and changed him and changed the face of Christianity. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll look forward to being with you next Wednesday as we will look at one of the judges, Deborah. Take care in God's peace.